Okay, welcome everyone. Um, Nobody online yet, but hopefully a few will pop in. A couple of things I want to go over tonight, just kind of an upfront miscellaneous article dealing with the economy, and then I want to get into kind of what's going on with more on anti-Semitism and kind of what is going on with our administration and the propaganda that's being spewed out. And I've got a couple of quick short videos that we'll talk about as well. But uh, and then I want to finish. We started a couple of weeks ago going over the Abrahamic covenant and the significance of that. So I want to go through that quickly, get through it, and then my goal, or what I'd like to do after that, is to spend some time looking at various parts of Daniel, including probably the most important second coming prophecy portion of the Bible, and that's Daniel chapter 9. So more to come on that. We'll get to it. No guarantees, but let's just see how we do. And the reason, before I read this article on the this economy thing, the reason that I keep talking about the administration and the anti-Semitism ties into what we're going to talk about in a few minutes. And that's God's promise to the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to bless those that bless them and to curse those that curse them. And it's an eternal, everlasting gift or promise that he made. We'll expand on that in a moment, but it's very significant, I think, uh, as far as the future of our country is concerned and what's going on throughout the world today. And quite frankly, if we don't see a change, I think God's hand, if it's not already, is just going to completely lift off this country. And we'll continue to see deterioration, but more on that in a moment. So we've been talking a lot about the economy. Anybody that's been paying attention the last 8 weeks or so knows that things are going pretty well. Stock market's doing well. Stock market is in a bullish mode, going up almost every day. But I'm here to say that that's probably not going to last. Again, nobody knows when or what specifically is going to happen. But this article is entitled "The Truth About the Economy That Mainstream Media Is Not Telling You," and I just find it so disheartening that so much is going on that they don't tell us about. Or if they do say something about it, you can tell they're lying because their lips are moving. It's just hard to get you're not going to get any truth from the mainstream media, which is very, very upsetting. And just a couple of portions from this. It seems as if it seems to you that the economic headlines that we are being fed by the mainstream media are completely and utterly disconnected from reality, you are definitely not alone. They tell us that inflation's under control, but I was just at the grocery store today and I could hardly believe the prices. They tell us that unemployment is low, but large companies are laying off workers in droves, and I think we're going to see a lot more layoffs in 2024. And they tell us that things are getting better for the middle class, but the truth is, by mid 2024, the vast majority of Americans will have less money than they did in 2019. The majority of Americans have burned through their excess savings piled up during the COVID-19 pandemic. And in the coming months, JP Morgan said it is likely that almost everyone will be worse off financially than they were in 2019. 80% of consumers state that nearly two-thirds, for nearly two-thirds of consumption has already depleted any savings cushion that they may have built during the lockdowns. That's 80% of those that may have built that up. It's almost as if we're getting poorer. How is that good news? So how in the world can they possibly claim that inflation is low? It's almost as if we're living in a bizarro world. At this point, it would cost the typical U.S. household $3.4 million to live the American dream over the course of a lifetime. So they're saying that young earners, in order to live the American dream, would have to accumulate 3.4 million by the time they get to retirement. Um, the American dream costs about 3.4 million. How many can accumulate 3.4 million? It's yeah, very few people exactly. And that gets to the fact that we're also seeing a growing divide, and this is not to uh, beat down on capitalism or anything, but a growing divide between those with wealth and those that don't have that wealth. There's a shrinking middle class in this economy, which ties right into Revelation chapter 6, which of course hasn't occurred yet. But again, as with everything else, I think the stage is being set. If you're like most Americans, you are never even going to come close to earning enough money to live a middle class lifestyle. That is why so many people out there have given up. In this economic environment, just hanging on to a decent job is an accomplishment. This week, we learned that General Motors will be laying off approximately 900 employees, which is 24% of its workforce. Meanwhile, Ford is cutting production of the F-150 Lightning pickup in half. They want us to purchase electric vehicles, but they don't tell us what they don't tell us is the maintenance and repairs are insanely expensive. Lucas Turner was driving a 2014 Infinity Hybrid when its check engine light made its annoying appearance on the scene, according to such and such a TV station. Not good, but with fewer than 70,000 vehicles on the road, he was not expecting the bill would be a whopper. Wrong. They called me and said, "Oh, I've got bad news, Mr. Turner. You need a new hybrid battery, and it's going to cost $18,000 for the battery and another 2,000 to have it installed." I could never see myself buying an electric vehicle, and there are tens of millions of other Americans that feel the same way. Hasbro just announced that it will be laying off more than 1,000 workers. Toy giant Hasbro is laying off more than 1,000 workers and closing its office in Providence, Rhode Island. Why would a toy company be laying off so many workers just before Christmas? Couldn't this be a boom time for them? Some people suspect it's directly due to their partnership with Disney, a brand which has become toxic for many Americans in recent years. So I think we all know the stories there. When a major toy company is laying off workers even before the holiday season is over, that's really a bad sign for the economy. Of course, things in Europe are even worse. We have to think globally when we think about the second coming of Jesus Christ, because he's coming back for the whole world. The whole world's going to be impacted and affected, and it's not just the United States what's going on here. And some of the things that we're seeing here are much worse in Europe and England and other places. At this point, it appears that Europeans are facing a continent-wide recession. The latest GDP figures show that the Eurozone contracted in the third quarter and looks like it will do the same the last 3 months of the year, falling into a continent-wide recession, Oxford Economics said in a note on December 8th. On the other side of the globe, we're being told that China's banking system is collapsing. In an interview with Andrew Ross Sorkin on CNBC on Monday, the Heyman Capital Management CIO pointed to China's property sector, which has been reeling in recent years as debts from major property owners soar and some firms default on their bonds. The real estate crisis has left many empty homes in China to house about 3 billion people. A former top Chinese official said, and the flood of unused supply will generate huge financial losses in the real estate sector. And of course, when the economy goes bad in China, that just further, I think, motivates them to do some crazy things. I mean, Taiwan is going to happen at some point in time, and that'll be just another major catastrophe. So don't believe the hype. The mainstream media would like us to believe that 2024 will be a wonderful year for the economy. But the truth is that the economic conditions have already been deteriorating all around us, and I am extremely concerned about what is coming during the year ahead. We've been propping up our standard of living for years by engaging in the greatest debt binge in the history of the world, but now that bubble has started to burst. A tremendous amount of discomfort is ahead of us, but the mainstream media will continue to insist that every jolt of pain is simply a bump on the road to endless prosperity. So, just another heads up in terms of the economy. We don't know when things are going to go bad. This current boon on Wall Street could last for a while, but it could also come crashing down pretty quickly. So, uh, more to think about. Okay, want to shift to back to Israel for the next few minutes if we can, and anti-Semitism. Uh, just a couple of headlines, and then I want to show a couple of videos and talk about the administration's real uh, thoughts and dealings with Israel. But the first one, and this goes back to October 11th, the shocking support of Hamas from U.S. academia. And of course, we saw that with the testimony a couple of weeks ago from the presidents of Harvard, MIT, and Penn, not willing to admit that or to acknowledge that the genocide of Jewish people is wrong. Um, so it's and there's just I mean, what's going on in the universities and in the high schools is all part of the campaign to just muddle the minds of young people, to indoctrinate them and to propagandize them to the point where they believe so much of what they hear because that's what they've been hearing for so long. San Francisco State University Associate Professor of Ethnic Studies fell in line behind the genocidal terrorist tweeting that Hamas members are merely defending themselves against colonial and racist violence. And if I were president of San Francisco State, I'd get rid of that person. I mean, that's just there can't be any room for people spouting off that type of stuff. Zayuda Zaytuna College professor of Islamic law and theology at the University of California, Berkeley, lecturer and chair of UCB's Islamophobia Research and Documentation Project, gave the terrorists support from America's left coast. He tweeted, Palestinians are calling for freedom, dignity, and true expression of solidarity. Befitting his vicious and long-standing anti-Semitism, his tweet included an advertisement for a forthcoming rally organized by his vile creation, the Hamas-aligned American Muslims for Palestine. UCB history professor uh, picked up on the theme of victimized Palestinians suffering under Israeli repression. They believe this stuff. They believe they're being repressed and oppressed by Israel. And so many, you see these massive demonstrations with people that just believe without doing any research whatsoever that Israel is the problem, the cause of everything that's going on. The West simply does not count Arab Palestinians as equal human beings, he said. Thus, Palestinians turn to armed struggle in face of massive Western funded and backed oppression. So it's always somebody else's fault. What Hamas did is the result of all this propaganda. Rutgers University assistant professor of African studies who believes Israel's mere existence, this is a professor at an American university. Israel's mere existence is criminal, saying the same pro terrorist tune. Any condemnation of violence is vapid if it does not begin and end with a condemnation of Israeli apartheid. Apartheid means that it's a segregationist um, um, environment or demographic that nobody else is allowed to live there, which was the problem in South Africa before Mandela came back. But not that he was a perfect person, but Israel is far from an apartheid state. 20% of the people that live in Israel are Arabs. So how can they be an apartheid state? But yet people read the stuff, hear the stuff, and they actually believe it. Um, Georgetown University chair of Islamic civilization mocked the fears of British broadcaster Rachel Riley, whose mother was Jewish. I just passed two cars in London driving with Palestinian flags flying from each one window, bouncing up and down in their cars, seemingly celebrating like they were having a party. And it goes on and on and on. So we're seeing so much of this vile attitude coming from the universities, and it just and the reason I bring this up is because it's so prophetic. Anti-Semitism is an irrational hatred of the Jewish people. There's no logic behind it. And so the reason that I bring it up is that it is so significant from a prophetic point of view. It has to happen that Israel, at the end of the day, or at the end of, as we get closer to Christ's return, will be all alone in the world. They'll have no allies, no friends, which will uh, cause them to endorse or to accept Antichrist when he comes on the scene and enters into an agreement with them. Here's another one. I'll just read the headlines for this one. Israel warns citizens. This goes back to November 7th. Not to travel as anti-Semitic incidents soar across the globe. So they're telling the Jewish people not to even travel. And of course, we mentioned this before, but clearly, I think what's happening is that all this anti-Semitism, and I'm surprised there hasn't been more violence. I think there will be more violence as time comes on, particularly against Jewish people. But what this is doing is motivating uh, Jews to return to Israel in fulfillment of God's promise to them. Okay. Was it the candy, Mark? We needed ibuprofen. So at any rate, I don't blame you. So at any rate, more that's just more on anti-Semitism. So, um, and I think that what I'm going to talk about next is also significant, beginning with an article entitled "The Persistent Two-State Delusion Will Be Forced Upon Israel in 2024." And let me see if I can pull up a a video. Another one I want to look at. We'll come back to that one in a moment. All right, well, let's start with this one. This, I think, is, I got this off of, saw it on Amir.
that you're
Everybody that's been watching Amir has probably seen this already, but I think it's pretty self-explanatory. There's no audio.
settlers attacking innocent Palestinians.
I continue to, I continue to be alarmed about extremist settlers attacking Palestinians in the West Bank.
Hello, Mr. President. We in Israel hear that you're alarmed by the extremist settlers attacking innocent Palestinians, leading to your decision to temporarily hold back the shipment of rifles to our country. And we would like to ask you one single question. Could you kindly provide a name, one name, of an innocent Palestinian Arab who lost their life in a premeditated attack carried out by a Jewish settler? I'm not referring to Palestinians killed while attempting to harm Jews, but rather a case where a settler deliberately left his home with the intention of killing a Palestinian. One name. From the beginning of this year, how about in the year 2022, 2021, 2020, 2019, 2018, 2017? Not even one incident, sir. Now let's look at the Jews that were intentionally slaughtered by those you worry about so much from the beginning of this year alone. February 26, two Jewish brothers on their way back home were fatally shot point blank in the murderous town of Hawara. Sweets were handed out the next day in the Palestinian streets. April 7th, a mother and two of her daughters were shot to death while driving to a vacation. Not one condemnation coming out from the innocent Palestinian society. May 30th, a father of two was shot to death in his car. July 20th, 4 Jews were murdered in a gasoline station near the ancient Jewish village of Eli. The terrorist family were subsequently added to the Palestinian authorities' payroll. August 19th, a father and his son were shot to death in the murderous town of Hawara, turning the perpetrators into heroes within their community. August 21st, a mother of 3 was murdered in front of one of her daughters, and celebrations followed in the innocent Palestinian society. According to the official Israeli government site, in January 2023, there were 187 attacks against Jews in Judea and Samaria alone, 157 terror attacks in February, 183 in March, April, 147 terror attacks against real innocent civilians. Add to these figures dozens more casualties within the Green Line up to October 7th, and hundreds more beyond, and it's impossible not to see a clear picture. Mr. President, if giving the opportunity, the Arabs surrounding the Jewish settlements would slaughter our children, rape our wives, exactly like they did to us in the Gaza border, and we don't need another October 7th to prove it. With all due respect, Mr. President, but your characterization of the righteous Jews of Judea and Samaria as violent and notorious people is nothing less than another blood libel against the Jewish people, and is a very big moral stain.
That is a very telling video. I thought it was very well done, and it's sad that our president is falling for this propaganda. Now, let me just pull this map up again, and we looked at one similar to this a couple of weeks ago. But this is the current map of Israel, and as you see here, what we have is the so-called West Bank. Now, after the Six-Day War in 1967, Israel secured the West Bank, and according to the laws of wartime, or the rules of wartime engagement, if a nation is attacked by bad actors or another nation or whatever, and they defeat those enemies and secure land, it's theirs to keep. And so prior to the Six-Day War, down here, the Gaza, which is what's in the news all the time now, as well as the Sinai Peninsula, and the West Bank, and even the Golan Heights, which are you can't really see, are up further north, separating or dividing Israel from Syria. But those were all under the control. Gaza was under the control of Egypt. The West Bank was under the control of Jordan. There was no Palestine uh, per se. There's never been a Palestine in history. But yet, if you listen to the propaganda from the other side, the ones that are responsible for all of the carnage and all the problems over there is Israel, because they have usurped or taken land from the so-called Palestinians. But at any rate, after 1967, Israel took back this land, including the West Bank. Now, I'll tell you, it's hard if you go to the internet, even though Israel now controls the West Bank, it's hard to find a map that does not include this. It's almost like a foregone conclusion that this is now already a part of the the two-state Palestinian solution. And what's interesting is that uh, after the war, and of course the West Bank prior to the war, was under the control of Jordan. And there were, again, no Palestinian thing. The whole Palestinian narrative really began in the mid 1960s, and I think I've mentioned this before, with Yasser Arafat. who began the propaganda campaign to lead the world to believe that the Palestinians were indigenous people, that they had always had the land, that they always controlled it. It was their land. Absolute lie. Arafat claimed at one point that he was born in a house right outside the West Bank or right outside the Temple Mount, just across the street from the Temple Mount. Well, he was born in Egypt, where he lived until he was 19 years old. So it's been one propaganda smear campaign after another. And if you listen to, and I see if I can find this other, I thought I had saved it, but I didn't. I'll check in a minute. This other interview with Joe Biden is one he did on 60 Minutes a while back, and essentially what he is still claiming is the answer to the Mideast problem is a two-state solution. In other words, to take the West Bank and Gaza and to create a nation between the two of them. It would be a state of Palestine, an independent state of Palestine. Now, one of the things that you hear a lot about on the news are the settlements, the Israeli settlements within the West Bank. And if you look at a map that points it out, it's many dots. They're like neighborhoods. And this is where Biden and the world is led to believe that because they live there, they have neighborhoods there, that they're the ones that are committing the atrocities, which is we just saw from that video, which I thought again was amazing. Kind of like not one example to back up what Biden said about the Jews harassing and killing and hurting uh, Palestinians in the West Bank. And so what we have here is the situation where now the United States and the rest of the world, the UN, everybody is clamoring for a two-state solution. They've always done that, and it's never going to happen. And let me just say, because in the West Bank, of course, we know that Gaza is under the control of Hamas. They are the governing rulers of the ruling party of Gaza. And what the world and what others will tell you is that the Palestinian people, the terrorists that live, the people that live in the West Bank are much more civil than those that live in than Hamas. Well, let's just look at a couple of statistics, and we just saw what, and in this video, I think clearly articulated and showed all of the atrocities that have been killed or that have been taken out and inflicted upon uh, Jews living in the West Bank. It never stops. And these are Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority is the ruling authority, if you will, of the so-called West Bank. They are the ones that are in charge under the Fatah group, which was Arafat's group. But it's really nothing but a terrorist organization under its current leader, Mahmoud Abbas, who's been there for many years. He's in his mid to late 80s. He wrote his thesis, his doctoral thesis, on the topic that the Holocaust never occurred. That's one of the big signs of an anti-Semite is to say that the Holocaust never really took place, and so that's what we're dealing with there. So to think that they could create this, and it's even been stated by Biden that Hamas would, or the Palestinian Authority, you can deal with them. Well, let's just see what some stats that come out from surveys that have been taken among the so-called Palestinian Authority. And I would say this, that if there were an election, and there hasn't been an election in the West Bank, and there hasn't been an election in Hamas in many, many years. But if there was an election in the West Bank right now that pitted the Palestinian Authority against Hamas, Hamas very likely would win. And so this is where they want to set up this additional territory for the two states. So here's a survey that was just recently taken. 75% of Palestinians, remember, this is not Gaza, support the October 7th massacre. 75% support it. And we've got these people Uh, and it hasn't been just the Democrat administrations. There have been Republican administrations as well. I mean, the Bush administration was big on the two-state solution. So it's not just as though it's one party, but it's a mindset that many people have that, oh, let's just let the Palestinian Authority control everything. 85.9% reject coexistence with Israel. So when you hear this chant from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, what they mean to say is we want every Jew out of this area completely. 71% are committed to the restoration of historical Palestine. There is no historical Palestine. Again, propaganda. If you were to talk to any of these professors at these various universities or people that are protesting, they would say that they've always been there. Well, they haven't. 74% support the creation of a Palestinian river from the river to the sea as the end of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Well, that'll do it. Get rid of all the Jews and turn everything over to the Palestinians. They're not interested in the two-state solution. Arafat made that very clear. 76% of Palestinians believe Hamas plays a somewhat to very positive role. This is in the West Bank, where they want to create the headquarters for this new state. 84% believe that Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which is just a terrorist group, plays a somewhat to very positive role. 80% believe that Fatah's another, that's the main group that's Hamas and it was Arafat and so forth. Their terror wing, the Alaska Martyrs Brigades, plays a somewhat to very positive role. And 88.6% believe that Hamas armed wing, the Al Qassam Brigades, plays a somewhat to very positive function. So here we have our administration pushing this crazy two-state solution as the outcome. Not right now. And uh, my, I think the thing that we have to bear in mind is when we get back into the Abrahamic covenant, that God's not going to take kindly to this. He is not. He's made it very clear that he will curse anybody that curses them, and we'll take a closer look at that in a moment. So here's this article: persistent two-state solution will be forced on Israel in 2024. Again, as we get further and further and further into this, and we're already hearing all this stuff coming back about all of the civilians that have been killed. And we talked about that a little bit last week. That many of these so-called civilians certainly support Hamas and participated in the October 7th uh, attack. And not only that, you cannot believe the reports coming out of Hamas. How many have been killed and so on and so forth. They've actually had this one guy, I don't know if you saw it on Amir's on his Telegram site. There's one guy that showed up in like three or four different pictures. One he's dead, and the other it's just one fake picture after another, and they're throwing this out, and people go, "Oh, look at this!" All of these kids and different people are being killed, and it's just an atrocity, that's taking place. Yeah, right. So the simmering tension between Israel and the Biden administration over the plan for post-war Gaza have now come to a boil. The U.S. is doubling down on its insistence that Gaza must be run by a revamped Palestinian Authority. That's what we just talked about. You saw the statistics. You saw the video, which clearly showed and identified all of the various attacks against Israelis that occurred this year, like that woman and her two daughters, just savagely attacked those two brothers. Just and then they hand out candy, and if a terrorist is killed, they'll literally pay his family uh, a wage for the rest of their lives. It's all upside down. but yet
The West Bank, like what proportion of the population is Palestinian?
I think it's like 20% maybe. 20%. Yeah, but don't quote me on that, but I know that the overall percentage in Israel of Arabs is about 20%.
Okay.
Most of the Palestinians, we talked about that last week, that are so-called refugees are stuck in various camps. Gaza is nothing but a refugee camp for the so-called uh, refugees that came from Israel when the 49 war, the 48 war took place. Um, this week, U.S. President Joe Biden told the White House Hanukkah reception that there has to be a Palestinian state in the future and that Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu needs to make an effort to strengthen, change, and move the PA, Palestinian Authority. Netanyahu reposted that Israel would permit neither Hamas nor the Palestinian Authority to rule Gaza. Thank the Lord for, people don't like Netanyahu. He's like certain politicians in this country that, while they're not perfect by any stretch, are just condemned by the media. Giving the Palestinian Authority control of Gaza and establishing a Palestinian state would expose much more of Israel to atrocities similar to those that took place on October 7th and worse. So the idea of a Palestinian two-state solution is just flat. Let's just say it like it is. It's nuts. It's crazy. But yet we have our administration pushing for it. Biden team presents wildly contradictory stances on Israel. And I won't go into all of that, but just more of the same. Uh, Anthony Blinken, was trying to dictate to Israel how to conduct the war against Hamas or that it was demanding that it end. He stated bluntly that while the United States has discussed these issues with Jerusalem, these are Israel's decisions to make. So, yeah, Israel has a right to defend itself. Nobody is denying that. But behind the scenes, an intense amount of pressure is being brought to bear on Israel by this administration, which brings me back to what we started a couple of weeks ago. If we can go back to Genesis, we'll see where God's relationship, and we looked at, hopefully remember a passage we looked at in Deuteronomy. I think it was Deuteronomy chapter 7. I'm not going to go back to that, but that says that the relationship between Israel and God is eternal, that they are His chosen people. And just by way of reminder, I just want to identify the various blessings that God promised Abraham and his descendants, the descendants from Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, not Ishmael. Now, Abraham later, Abram, his name was later changed to Abraham because he was the father of many nations, which included the descendants of Ishmael. But this promise that God made to create a great nation very clearly, as we'll see in just a moment, was passed from Abraham to Isaac, not to Ishmael. And we can see that was clearly stated in Genesis, I think it's 16. I'll get back to that in a moment. But in Genesis 12, I just want to quickly go through these blessings. So God called Abram and said to him, "Move to this nation, to this land I will be giving to you." And of course, that was at the time Canaan, which ultimately became the land of Israel. And God gave it to Abraham and his descendants as an everlasting inheritance. And he says in Genesis 12, 2, I will make your name great. Well, just before that, he says, uh, I will make you into a great nation, which is a promise that from you and your wife Sarah will come a new nation. And God had a purpose for doing that. He had a purpose for creating a good new nation because the world had become awash in paganism. So he needed to start over. He could have wiped humanity off, but he didn't, wiped it out. But instead, I'm going to create a new people, a new nation, through whom I will reveal myself to them and to the world. I will make you into a great nation and bless you, and I will bless you. I will make your name great. You will be a blessing. And here we go. I will bless those who bless you. And here's the thing that when we talk about all of these things going on with the administration and the two-state solution and all of this other nonsense that's going on, whoever curses you, I will curse. That's not just a promise to Abraham, but it's a promise to Abraham and his descendants, those that will make up the great nation that he's already promised. And be blessed, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. And of course, we know that Jesus, that Christ, the Messiah, came through the lineage of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He didn't come through Ishmael. And so the nation that's being referred to here is the nation of Israel. And it's interesting as you go through, if you really did a deep dive on how God was sure to protect and preserve that bloodline, that you go right to Isaac at the very beginning. Ordinarily, the custom of the day was for the firstborn son to receive the inheritance. Ordinarily, it would be Ishmael that would receive, according to the customs of the time, the promise that was first bestowed upon Abraham. But God says no, as we read, I think I could find it here in Genesis 17. Um, is it 16? If I can find it. Oh, we'll come back to it. But at any rate, he clearly established that it would not be Ishmael that would receive the benefit. Oh, listen, okay. 17. Abraham fell face down. He laughed and said to himself, so here's Abraham getting close to 100 years old. Sarah is about 90. God's promising a great nation will come from him, which means he has to have a son. And so Abraham's just kind of shaking his head and said, Abraham fell face down. He laughed and said to himself, will a son be born to a man 100 years old? Will Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? And Abraham said to God, if only Ishmael might live under your blessing. In other words, he's my firstborn son. Pass the blessing to him. And God said, yes, but your wife Sarah will bear you a son, and you will call him Isaac. I will establish notice it says my covenant, not our covenant. This is a unilateral covenant. It's unconditional, unilateral, and it's everlasting. My covenant with him is what? An everlasting covenant for his descendants after him. And then he goes on to say, as for Ishmael, I have heard you. I will surely bless him. I will make him fruitful, will greatly increase his numbers. He will be the father of 12 rulers, and I will make him into a great nation. But my covenant I will establish with Isaac. So ordinarily, the blessing or the covenant promises would be passed through Isaac or Ishmael. But God did a flip. He says, no, it's going to be because it had to be uh, he had to come it had to come from the union between Abraham and Sarah. And what we learn as we go through and we study, and he did the same thing when it came to Jacob and Esau. Esau was the firstborn, but Esau sold his birthright later for a cup of stew, and so that promise that started, or the birthright, or the promises that started with Abraham, flowed to Isaac, and then not to Esau, the firstborn, but again to Jacob, the secondborn. And so the reason for that is God repeatedly states throughout the Old Testament, the Jewish people are not to marry foreign women, Canaanite women. And we know that's exactly what Esau did, and it's exactly what Ishmael did. So if that had happened, that bloodline would have been contaminated, which would have meant that the Messiah could not have come. And so God's got this whole thing. I mean, even fine little details like that in place to make sure that his promises are fulfilled. So then if we go back to, and it's interesting, if you go back to that map I threw up a little bit ago here, let me show it again. The West Bank. And interesting as we see these discussions between Abraham and God, where God says, look north, look east, look west, look south, all of the land you can see, I will give to you and to your descendants forever. It's yours as an everlasting covenant. And so that's a lot of these things are happening in Hebron, or Hebron as it's more appropriately pronounced, which is right smack dab in the middle, or within the boundaries of the so-called West Bank. So you got a contradiction there. You've got the world saying that this land, which God clearly told Abraham was theirs when he identified the boundaries, the borders of the land he was going to give them in Hebron. But yet Hebron now, interestingly, is in the hands of, well, it's in the so-called West Bank. So we have a contradiction there. It can't be. This is all land that we see here that God gave to the Israelites, to the Jewish people. So if we go to, and I know we went through this the last time, but 14, verse 14 of chapter 13. The Lord said to Abram after Lot had parted to him, look from where you are to the north, to the south, to the east, and the west. And this is what's significant. And all this land that you see, I will give to you and your offspring forever. So if that land doesn't belong to Israel, if those that subscribe to replacement theology or are endorsing a two-state solution uh, are defying God. And if that were to happen, then that would do what? That would make God a liar. And if he lied about that, how do we know we can trust him when it comes to things like salvation? You can't. And so God says what he means and means what he says. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth. So remember, at this point in time, it was only Abraham or Abram and Sarah. And so not only is he promising them the land and everything else, but he's saying your descendants are going to be as numerous as, in a metaphorical way as the stars in the skies and the sand on the seashores. Then he says, if anyone could count the dust, then your offspring could be counted. So that's a pretty hefty promise. And think about when Jacob and his family went into Egypt about 400 years after this. They went in as a family, and then 400 years later, well, it came out as a great nation. So God had them go into Egypt where they were in captivity all that time, but yet they came out as a nation, and they have continued to grow since then, fulfilling uh, that uh, that prophecy right there. Then look at what we just saw with the map. So Abram went to live near the great trees of Mamre at where? Hebron, where he pitched his tent. There he built an altar to the Lord. So clearly, God said, "This land is yours, and it's the land will be the land of your ancestors as an everlasting inheritance." Now let's go to chapter 15. This is where uh, God creates this, or formalizes or codifies this covenant between Abraham and his descendants and himself. And the custom at the time when two parties came together and entered into a covenant, or what we might call today a contract, is that they would take and they would divide these offerings in two and separate them. And then the two parties would walk hand in hand between those parallel lines of offerings, and that would be like a signing for a mortgage today. Two parties, the seller and the buyer, get together. The buyer agrees to purchase, and the seller agrees to sell. And once they sign their names on the dotted line, a deposit's paid, and so forth, the contract is entered into. So that's what we have here. So in verse chapter 15, we read, let's just read through this, beginning of verse 1. After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. And so there you have it, right at the very beginning. Uh, Abraham being the number one patriarch of the Jewish people, God is saying, I'll be your shield. And he's doing the same thing today. He's serving as the shield for the descendants of Abraham. What can you give me since I remain childless? And the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus. So that's another custom at the time that if there was not a firstborn son, then or a son, then the the leader, the servant, the head servant of the person would actually receive the inheritance. So Abram, not knowing what's going on, says, "Well, then the promise you made to me, God, has to go through Eliezer." And Abram said, "You have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir," which again, the custom of the time. Then the word of the Lord came to him: "This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir." And then God took him outside and said, "Look up to the sky, count the stars. Indeed, if indeed you can count them, then he said to him, so shall your offspring be." In other words, very numerous. Abram believed the Lord. That's an interesting thing because even in the New Testament, in Hebrews and other places, it said that Abraham trusted and believed in the Lord, and it was credited to him as righteousness. So there we have it, right there. The reason why I think is found here, that God chose Abraham, because He told him these things, and Abraham believed Him, and he credited it to him as righteousness. He also said to him, "I am the Lord who brought you out of the Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land and to take possession of it." Again, that's the land we know today to be Israel. But Abram said, "Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it?" So the Lord said to him, "Bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon." Abram brought all these to him, cut them in two, and arranged their halves opposite each other. Again, parallel lines, if you will, of these offerings that have been cut in two, arranged opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. Then the birds of prey came down to the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. As the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. In other words, God put him into a sleep that he wasn't going to come out of until the time was right. So he's laying there sound asleep. Then the Lord said to him, "Know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated there." So that's a prophecy about their uh, going into Egypt, where they did remain for 400 years, and under Moses, ultimately were brought out. Um, but I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterwards they will come out with great possessions. So remember the story of the parting of the Red Sea, and when Pharaoh and his military went into it and they were covered and they all drowned. That's a fulfillment of what God said would happen here. So here's God telling him that 400 years they'll be in captivity, and he was going to ultimately bring them out. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterwards they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. In other words, this is going to happen long after you're gone. In the fourth generation, your descendants will come back here. So in other words, they're going to come back to the promised land. For the sins of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. Here we go. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking fire pot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. Now, this smoking fire pot and blazing torch symbolizes God Almighty. That's God. He's the flaming torch. He's the smoking fire pot. And notice that he, by himself, passed through the pieces. Now, why is that significant? Because he was fulfilling the custom of the time of establishing a covenant, or we'll call it a contract or an agreement, but it was solely dependent upon him. It was a unilateral agreement. It required nothing on the part of Abraham and his descendants to fulfill anything. Now, later on, there was another covenant, the Mosaic covenant, which was the law, which basically God established under Moses, and Jesus came and fulfilled the law. But that covenant basically contained a couple 600 provisions of do's and don'ts. That if you do this, I'll bless you. If you disobey me, I'll curse you. That was the law. That was a different covenant. This covenant, often referred to as the Abrahamic covenant, was unilateral and required only God to fulfill. Why? Because God knew that if there were any provisions or conditions that would have to be placed on the descendants of Abraham, they'd never be able to keep them. And so here we have this unilateral um, uh, covenant that God Himself fulfilled. And on that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram. The Lord made the covenant. To your descendants, I give this land from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river of the Euphrates. And I think we saw that map that showed a much bigger piece of real estate that God gave to them than they currently occupy or ever have occupied throughout history. And so that's coming. So what we have is this unilateral, unconditional covenant. And it's very important to remember that because today, that covenant, the Abrahamic covenant, is as relevant today as it was then. And so the covenant consists of the promises we just outlined, including the bless and the curse, the coming of the Messiah, the land, the number of descendants, and also it says that He, God, will be their God. That was another component of this covenant. And that's a reference to the time when Jesus Christ will accept, or the Israelites, the Jews, will accept Jesus Christ. That's one that has not, for the most part, been fulfilled. And so we see that. So any questions on that? So it's very important that today we see that this covenant relationship is solely dependent upon on God to fulfill. So let's take a look at, if I can find it here in my notes. Hebrews, just keep your fingers here and flip to Hebrews chapter 6. Hebrews 6, verse 13. And my Bible, the title of this, beginning in verse 13, is The Certainty of God's Promise. And here in Hebrews 6:13, when God made his promise to Abraham, what promise? The one we just read about, the Abrahamic covenant, the everlasting, eternal, unilateral, unconditional covenant. Since there was no one greater for him to swear to, he swore by himself. So, in other words, this promise uh, to bless Israel and to create a great nation and so forth, Again, it's confirmed here. He could swear to no one greater for him to swear to by, he swore by himself. So he's confirming that this is an unconditional unilateral covenant. Now, God made these promises that go all the way back to Genesis to Israel. Does that mean that Israel would always occupy the land? No. Did it mean that they wouldn't stumble and fall? No. Did it mean that was a nation recognized their Messiah? No. They've been blinded throughout history. They've not been allowed to occupy or control the land. It's been 2,600 years, right up till 1948, that they were not allowed to control the land. But God made a promise to them, and that promise has its roots and its origin in this covenant. So still in Hebrews 6:14, saying, I will surely bless you and give you many descendants. So after waiting patiently, Abraham received what was promised. People swear by someone greater themselves, and the oath confirms what is said and puts an end to all argument, because God wanted to make the unchanging nature, so it's unchanging, and those that subscribe to replacement theology, that say that the church has somehow replaced Israel, and there are those, it's a significant percentage of the church, by the way, that follow this replacement theology doctrine. What they're saying is that God is basically forsaken all of these promises he's made to Israel, and that they've been imputed or given now to the church. Well, that makes what we're reading here patently untrue, because people swear by someone greater than themselves, and the oath confirms what is said and puts an end to all argument. Because God wanted to make the unchanging, as we read in either Micah or Malachi, I forget one, that God never changes. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. He never ever changes. The nature of his purpose very clear to the heirs. What was promised, he confirmed it with an oath, his oath, his doing. God did this so that by two unchangeable things in which it's impossible for God to lie. So those that subscribe to replacement theology, and they really have to allegorize the scriptures to get there. It's just such a stretch. But basically, I think what they're saying is that, okay, then if God did this, created this covenant, this unilateral covenant, by two unchangeable things in which it's impossible for God to lie, well, they're saying that God did lie, right? Isn't that the conclusion that you have to come to? That we know that's not true. We who have fled to take hold of the hope set before us may be greatly encouraged. We have this hope as an anchor for the soul, firm and secure. It enters the inner sanctuary behind the curtain, where our forerunner, Jesus, has entered on our behalf. He became the high priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. So there's confirmation right there. And we've got many other scriptures I'm not going to go through that confirm that this covenant established by God is unilateral, everlasting, and unconditional, which means that land belongs to them. And then this is kind of the beginning, or kind of the foundation of other unconditional covenants, like the Davidic covenant that we read about in Second Samuel, that says that God will, that Jesus will take upon the sins of the world, and I'm really paraphrasing that covenant. Or the new covenant we read about in Jeremiah, where it says that he will create a new covenant with who? With Israel, not the church. He didn't say we'll create a new covenant with Israel or with the church. He said, I'm going to create a new covenant with Israel. And then what did Jesus say at the Last Supper? I am the new covenant. So Jesus confirmed that he is the new covenant, and that covenant was established between God and Israel. And then, interesting, later on in the New Testament, we discover beautifully and miraculously that we as Gentiles are grafted in to that covenant, to those promises. that we're like a wild olive root, or olive branch. We're grafted into this perfectly cultivated tree and allowed to partake in the root, the Jesus Christ, who is the root of this wild olive tree or bush or whatever it is. And so here we have it, and then Romans also says, Paul says that we're to make Israel, we're to make them jealous of what we have, so that they too will think and ultimately come. So we're blessed to be tied into this old covenant, this Old Testament promise that Jesus fulfilled. We've got this tremendous blessing that we're partaking in this, in salvation through the shed blood of Jesus Christ. And what do we do in return? What do people do? As well as a reward, we're going to tell you that God's finished with Israel. Yeah, it's just such a curse on the church. So, I'm not going to get into Daniel 9, but let me just quickly go to Genesis 17, some verses there, where it says that, and this is just confirmation that the covenant was passed from Abraham to Isaac, not to Ishmael. And in Genesis 17, beginning in verse 1, and we'll read through the first 19 verses. Oh, we won't read it all. We'll read through the first 8 verses. When Abram was 90 years old, the Lord appeared to him, said, I, God Almighty, walk before me faithfully and be blameless. Then I will make, notice it's not our covenant. Notice he says, what? My covenant between me and you, and will greatly increase your numbers. Abram fell face down, and God said to him, As for me, here it is again, this is my covenant with you. You will no longer be the father of you will be the father of many nations. No longer will you be called Abram. Your name will be Abraham, for I have made you the father of many nations. There we go, personal pronoun I, will make you very fruitful. That's a promise to create all of these descendants. I will make nations of you. Kings will come from you. Again, it doesn't say we, our covenant will accomplish this. I will establish my covenant, what? As an everlasting covenant between me and you and your descendants after you for the generations to come, to be your God and the God of your descendants after you. So there you have it right there, as clear as it could possibly be, that this is an everlasting, eternal covenant. And it's unilateral because he kept saying I. He doesn't say we. And so, um, and I will be their God. I think that's a clear reference to uh, the Lord Jesus Christ. Let's just quickly go to First Chronicles chapter 16, and we'll end with this. First Chronicles 16. A lot of people think that the Old Testament's so boring, but I'll tell you what, I think I mentioned, I just got done a couple of weeks ago reading First and Second Kings. Man, it's a powerful read. If you haven't read it in a while, or if you haven't read it at all, I strongly recommend that. Let's start at verse 12, verse 11. Look to the Lord in his strength. Now remember that the Old Testament always relates to Israel. We don't find the church coming into play until the New Testament. Seek his face always. Remember the wonders he has done, his miracle and the judgments he's pronounced. You, his servants, the descendants of Israel. Now, we didn't do it, but we find in I think probably everybody knows this, but in Genesis, I think it's 32 maybe, it states that God changed Jacob's name to Israel because Jacob meant cheater. And he was a little bit deceptive, he and his mother, when it came to the birthright. And he even went to the point where he dressed as a hairy person like his brother Esau and deceived his father Isaac into thinking it was him. And then the covenant we just talked about was passed from Isaac to Jacob. And so Jacob essentially cheated his way to the birthright, even though Esau had already given it up earlier, but he went ahead and did that. And Rebecca, his mother, or was Rebecca his mother? Um, yeah, whoever his mother, Rebecca, yeah, Rebecca was Jacob's mom, and she was told when they were in the womb that two sons are going to come from you, and the older will serve the younger. So it was confirmed that the promise would go to Jacob and not to the firstborn, who turned out to be Esau. So she apparently forgot that, and she was in collusion with when Jacob, when all this happened. So Jacob went into exile for 20 years, and during that period of time learned a lot of lessons and wanted his name changed. He didn't want to be known as the cheater, the deceiver anymore. So on his way back from uh, where had been on his way back to the Holy Land to ultimately meet up with Esau, he had a little bit of a tussle with God. I think it was with Jesus, and God pulled his hip out of socket, and ultimately Jacob wouldn't let go until he said, "Please change my name." And he says, "Okay, I'm going to change your name from Jacob to Israel," which means prince with the fathers or something like that. But that's where the term Israel came from. God changed Jacob's name from Jacob to Israel. And so when you see uh, references to things like the children of Jacob, that's just the same as saying Israel. He is the Lord our God. His judgments are in all the earth. He remembers his covenant, and this is the reason I wanted to bring this up. What? Forever. The promises he's made for 1,000 generations, which means, guess what? All of these promises, including the land, are still in effect today. The covenant he made with Abraham, the oath he swore to Isaac, he confirmed it to Jacob as a decree, to Israel as what? An everlasting covenant. That's why he went through those pieces by himself. Um, to you, I will give the land of Canaan, which we know to Israel, as the portion you will inherit. When they were but few in number, few indeed, and strangers in it, they wandered from nation to nation, referring to the Israelites, from one kingdom to another. He allowed no one to oppress them. For their sake, he rebuked kings. Do not touch. And so here we get really up close and personal with the relationship between God and the Israelites, the Jewish people, including those today. Doesn't mean they're perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but because he created and established this oath and confirmed it himself, it's what it is. Do not touch my anointed ones. Do my prophets no harm. And then let's just quickly go, and we'll finish with this. Psalm 105 and verse 10. 105 verse 10. Here we go. Let's just um, in verse 8. He, God, remembers his covenant. His covenant. Again, that's the key I'm trying to, the thing I'm trying to mention here. Forever. The promise he made for 1,000 generations, essentially what we just read in First Chronicles. The covenant he made with Abraham, the oath he swore to Isaac, he confirmed it to Jacob as a decree, to Israel as an everlasting covenant. To you, I will give the land of Canaan as the portion you will inherit. When you were but few in number, few indeed, and strangers in it. Again, it's basically the same uh, verses we just read in First Chronicles. So God makes it crystal clear that that land was given to Abraham's descendants is an eternal, everlasting inheritance. The Palestinians, so called, have no right to the land. The Biden administration has no right whatsoever in telling Netanyahu and Israel what to do with that land or how to prosecute the war or anything else. God is the one that watches over Israel. They're the apple of his eye. He'll take care of them. And that's what God's going to allow to happen. That's in part the reason why Israel will ultimately be by themselves, because God, oftentimes, when he deals with Israel, allows them to be pushed right to the brink, and then he will intercede. And so the stage is being set for all of this to take place. And we, as a country, unless something happens, and we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, next week, next month in terms of elections or who's in charge or whatever. But if things don't change, we're going to pay a price. And we as a nation, we as a people, now I still believe that before things get to be really bad, that we're going to be pulled out of here. So we have that promise that we're going to be pulled out, raptured, taken away, caught up in the air before the really bad stuff takes place. So the bad stuff is the stage is being set for all the bad stuff, and that's it. So we'll get together again on January 2nd. That'll be the next time. Uh, in the meantime, have a Merry Christmas.
When was the land called who named Israel? Was it when it became a nation in 1948?
Uh,
Because it's obviously
yeah, well, Israel is the land and the people. So when here's my, and I'm guessing because I don't know for sure, but when God changed his Jacob's name, I think that's when that happened. Yeah, the land of Israel. So if you listen to various experts, they'll say Israel is the land and the people, the Jewish people. So as good an answer as I can get. As Jack will tell you, oftentimes if I don't know the answer, I just make one up.
Well, that's the problem I know it by letting the facts get in the way. Two things, three facts.
Sure.
aren't God's people Abraham's descendants of faith?
Pardon me?
Aren't God's people who are the descendants of Abraham in the faith? Okay,
Hmm.
aren't they all also
Right.
referred to as Israel?
Well, there's you call it spiritual Israel and there's natural Israel. You know, we are part of spiritual Israel because we're tied into that relationship that God established. So yeah, spiritually we're all descendants of Abraham, but we can't lose sight of the fact that he has a plan for natural Israel for the Jewish people. Okay. So it mentions in the Olivet Discourse, it talks about, Jesus talks about the elect, and those are believers, and I believe he has two groups of elect, believers, the church, and Israel. So, okay. Well, Merry Christmas, everyone, and just
Christmas
Father, I just thank you, Lord, for bringing us together. I thank you, Lord, for your word. I thank you, Lord, for uh, making your purposes so well known and so obvious to us. And all we have to do is just look, just pay attention. And you admonished the first century Israelites for not knowing their Bibles, and that's why you wept over Jerusalem. If only they had known this day. It's so crystal clear, as we'll learn when we get to the book of Daniel, chapter 9. And that's the same charge as you've given us, to know the times in which we live, so that our hearts are made ready and that we're telling others about you, Lord. Help us to do that boldly and confidently. Lord, we have nothing to be ashamed of and nothing to worry about. If you're with us, who could possibly be against us? So I ask you, bless everyone here, bring us back next week or in 2 weeks, And look forward to getting back into your word. In Jesus' name, amen.